Chapter 20. The New Republic. It was a popular belief amongst the Muslims of Istanbul that if they prayed in the same mosque as their sultan at the same hour, God would listen with greater intensity to their supplications. Consequently, the shadow of God, as the sultan was called, was everywhere followed by admiring paradise-yearning crowds. I remember a morning in the Bayezid Mosque when I was in the middle of such a crush that it was not possible to do anything but remain in a cramped, semi-upright position, with danger from the movement of arms and legs all about me. When the prayers began, I was in an even greater quandary, for the person in front of me, who was a porter, had a pair of evilly smelling feet, and when I attempted to make my obedience impelled forward and downwards by the pressure from behind, I was almost drowned in the odour of dirt and perspiration so perilously close to my nose. It was an odour sufficient, I swear, to kill even the rats who sported in the mosque's lavatories. But fear of the Lord held me in my place securely, and I stifled my squeamishness and eventually escaped from the mosque to wash my hands and face in the water basins in the garden. I gulped the clean, sweet air as avidly as a man newly rescued from a gaseous mine. Those days, during Ramadan, there were no lessons in the schools, and we were allowed home on leave. 27 years ago, the streets at Ramadan were crowded as they have not been since, and perhaps never will be again. Not only the Muslims who were keeping the fast were in the streets, but the British, French, and American soldiers were there too to watch the ceremonies. And on the last night of Ramadan, in the year of which I write, Bayezid Square and its mosque were places not to be forgotten by those who saw them. The tall, slender minarets of the mosque were ringing with gleaming electric candles, and between the minarets, silhouetted brilliantly against the dark sky, stretched electric lettering, Avida Ramadan, meaning goodbye Ramadan. The nostalgia of the words and the effect of so much nocturnal beauty caught at the heart in a strange sadness, even though this was meant to be a happy occasion. On both minarets were the muezzins, their chanting, lovely voices busily calling the people to prayer. And the square itself and the gardens of the mosque were thronged with silent listening people, like an army of dead people. And high above them swayed the muezzins, their voices the only sound in that vast silence. I edged my way to the mosque, but cautiously, for one felt oddly guilty to be moving in the dead sea of silence. The interior of the mosque was ablaze with light. Light poured down from the great chandeliers in the arched dome. The dome itself was ringed with light that glittered as the glasses swayed. And on the walls, branching gigantic candelabra threw a blinding glare over everything. Many muezzins were here too, reading from the Koran, and the faithful bowed and moved in unison and beat their breasts. I remember I was aflame that night with the pomp and the splendour, the majesty, and all my senses reeled. One day, the Armenians left Kulalai, and the American flag was hauled down and up ran the red of the Turkish flag. We senior boys left the grey, ancient building on the hill and moved into the white palace fronting the Bosphor, and great was our joy to be here at last. Kulalai's rooms were large and bright, and, as a welcome change from oil lamps, we had our own electrical plant. The classrooms were on the ground floor, facing the dusty, quiet road, and there was silence all day long, for no one came to Kulalai, save the students or the officers stationed there. A mosque was established in the basement, and on our first evening in the school, we were all herded there for prayers of thanksgiving. Whether we wished or no, religion was forced down our throats. I had lost some of my early adolescence fever, but I needed no forcing. Many of the older boys, however, resented the interference of the officers, especially when they used large sticks as a better means of persuasion. In those days in Turkey, when the Muslim religion was a national institution, a fixed habit of the centuries, the Kulalai gardens would be full of sudden, protesting boys washing their hands and faces under the fountains, balancing against a tree whilst they pulled socks over their newly cleaned feet, rushing at the last moment to the lavatories for more private ablutions, and everyone in panic for fear of being late. Muezzin would start to read, and groans rent the air, for that surely meant that we were late already. Irate officers would be stationed at the mosque door, their sticks ready in their hands to whack smartly the backsides of the latecomers. When Kemal Ataturk formally declared on October 29, 1923, that our country was now a republic, everything slowly began to change its face. Orders were sent to Kulalai that it would no longer be necessary to force the students to go to the mosque. Religion was to be free. So the sticks were temporarily abandoned, and only the merest handful of boys now attended the mosque. But this time the sticks were brought out for quite a different purpose, for we who still visited the mosque were frequently late for lessons, and whereas before the sticks had soundly whacked the backsides of reluctant devotees, now commenced a crazy period when they whacked the backsides of reluctant scholars. Ataturk and his government decided that religion and public affairs must be separated, and the new constitution read, "The language of the Turkish Republic is Turkish, and the capital, Ankara." Whereas formerly it had read, "The religion of the Turkish Republic is Muslim, the language Turkish, and the capital, Ankara." The change was far greater than perhaps it would appear to European eyes. Religion was practically abolished since, although the mosques remained places of worship, the people no longer had time to pray the prescribed 5 times a day, save the old and perhaps the infirm who had no public duties to perform. The majority of the Turks simply had no time. The work of the government offices could no longer wait on the prayers of the officials. Religious teachings were abolished in all schools, Muslim or Christian, and religious sects were no longer permitted to appear in the streets in the clothes of their particular religious order. Now, when the Muslim called, there were few to listen and fewer still to respond. The weekend was changed also. We observed the Christian Saturday and Sunday in place of the old Muslim Thursday and Friday. The mosque at Kulalai was abandoned and given over to broken chairs and tables in need of repair. Our uniform changed and became the familiar navy blue of today's students, with a smart red line down the seam of the trousers, and a hat with the smallest suspicion of a peak was issued, for the fez had been abolished by law. At weekends, Mehmed and I would go proudly home, my grandmother being convinced that there were not 2 better looking boys in all Turkey. Muazzez was now 9, attending a girls' day school in Bayezid. A pert, conceited little thing she was, with her long twinkling legs and their demure black silk stockings, her brief skirts flying out jauntily. She was incredibly pretty, and her hair had still further lightened with the years, so that by now it was almost blonde. My grandmother spoiled her, and she'd never spoiled Mehmed or me. Perhaps she'd softened with age. She was as autocratic as ever, and quite frequently had long, bitter quarrels with my mother. After a time, weekends spent at home were no longer a novelty, and I spent more and more of my free time at Kulalai. We would swim together whole summer days in the Bosphor, afterwards lazing in the school gardens, pleasantly conscious that this was the weekend and that no lessons loomed before us for 2 days. Just prior to Ataturk's abolition of the fez, the military were issued with a small round cap that had the suspicion of a peak on it. The peak, we were told, was to guard the eyes against the sun. It was so small, however, that the idea of it being able to guard against anything, let alone the sun, was laughable. We had previously worn a fez with the Turkish moon and stars woven into the front, and we were now very much ashamed to be seen with our new headgear, which was really, we thought, too much like the hat the Christians wore. So we carried the offensive hat in our hands as often as we dared, and the few boys who were brave enough to keep it on were called Gavur, an epithet relating to a Christian in an unsavoury way. When I used to pass through Bayezid, all the old men in the coffee houses and those sitting at the tables in their streets would look at the cap with the apology of a peak and shake their grey heads. "What is this?" they would mutter in dismay. "Where is this country going to?" One day, the district barber, not the barber of an earlier episode in my childhood, came up to me in the street and solemnly advised me never to put this terrible Christian thing on my head. It is a Christian hat, he warned. If a Muslim puts such a shocking thing on his head, the good God will surely punish him. When I laughed at him, he grew angry and later complained to my grandmother about my lack of piety. It was in 1925 that Ataturk ordered that from henceforth all men in Turkey must wear the Christian hat. What a consternation there was when, and the state of the nation's nerves. Was Ataturk playing with them? Was he sitting in his chateau in Ankara devising new things to disturb and break their habits of centuries? The men indignantly refused to throw away the fez, and it became a usual sight to see fighting taking place between the supporters of the new order and the diehards of the old. Government officials were the first to give way to Ataturk. They were forced into this position by reason of their work. The streets became full of bowler hats, worn with a self-conscious air. The children used to throw stones after them, and the police arrested men who still persisted in wearing the fez. And the street sellers in desperation put fancy paper hats on their heads and added a note of unusual gaiety to the marketplaces. And out in the country places and villages, the men even wore women's hats in order to evade arrest. The old men took to tying handkerchiefs on their heads, placing the offending Christian hat over this, but the police became wise to this ruse and promptly arrested them. Arrested men were hauled to the police station in such great numbers that they could not be dealt with. The white handkerchiefs were pulled off the bald pates, the insulting headgear being firmly clamped over the naked, uneasy heads. 1925 is also memorable for me because I met Suna. She was 16 and we saw each other at the weekends, our meetings being a great secret from our families. When I had enough pocket money, we would go to a cinema where we could sit and hold hands in the dark, never bothering to watch the flickering, leaping shadows on the screen. At other times, we would climb the hill to casino, where we would drink iced lemonades through a straw. If I had no money, we would walk in Gulhane Parke or join the crowds on Galata Bridge to watch the boats. I loved to do this, but Suna was not interested in a remote future of travel and would complain that the boats were smelly and noisy and gave her a headache. Nevertheless, I was sadly and tenderly in love with her. Sometimes I and a few others would take our textbooks into the country at weekends, asking farmers on the way if we could buy cucumbers or tomatoes from them. Usually they permitted us to take as much as we wished and then would refuse to accept payment from us. Well laden, we would go to the top of the hill above Kulalai, a quite lovely spot where spring trickled icily, and we would put our vegetables or fruits here to wash them before finding a comfortable place to study. Time passed swiftly there in that tranquil place. When we were hungry, we would feast royally off the collection of food, feeling at peace up there in the lonely, silent hills. Sometimes tiring of study, I would lean against my particular fir tree and look down to the Bosphor shining coolly below me. There was a good view from that tree, I remember, right down to the Bosphor, to the Black Sea. Little Bebek was in front of me in all its shimmering morning beauty. If I turned my head a little to the right, I could see the famous fortress walls on the Asian side. Back again to Istanbul, to that other fortress, that old crumbling fortress built in 1451-52. And the parts I could see from my tree are the narrowest parts of all, being a little over 649 meters only. And there's a story about this which says that the Sultan Mehmed once approached the Emperor Constantine and asked to be granted a piece of land on Europe's side. Constantine, it appears, acceded to this request, stipulating that the land would only be the size of a cow's skin. So Sultan Mehmed took a cow's skin, had it cut into narrow strips, then laid them end to end and built his fortress according to this measurement. And no matter how the emperor protested, he was always told one thing, that the land only measured just so much as a cow's skin. When I was a child, how often I heard this story. And all down the Bosphor, down to the Black Sea, ran the tall trees, and the old wood houses that suit the skyline so well. If I turned my head to the left, there on the hilltop, I could see the Dolmabahce Sarai, white and artificial as a wedding cake in its beautiful setting. Miniature mosques front the water's edge, and there at the end of all the shining palaces lay Istanbul, my Istanbul, that will forever hold something of my heart. Grey it would look from this hill, and the smoke from the boats would lie over it like a soft veil, and tall and tapering are the minarets that enchant the skyline, and from my hill I would see, behind the mosques, the Marmara like a faint line of tread. Study would be suddenly hard, and I would turn back to the books reluctantly, only half aware of the printed word. Towards evening, when the sun grew kinder, we would put away our books and stroll down the hill to Anadolu Hishari, where we would play football, for we never forgot to bring the football, whatever else we might forget. Later, in the soft green dusk, the hot day behind us only a memory, we would return to Kulalai, and there was no one to notice our coming, save perhaps the fishermen in their rowing boats, and to them we were no novelty.